The Chief Justice was very big on process, very big on giving people their day in court. Used to laugh. Civil cases weren't too complicated. There was liability and damages. Criminal cases had a whole variety of subjects. He'd been a former assistant county attorney in Polk County before he went on the bench. Presided over jury trials in Polk County for over 20 years. Had an appreciation of both sides of the table and both areas of the practice, criminal law and the civil law. I think it's fair to say that he wanted to be certain that cases, for the most part, were decided on the merits and felt very strongly about that. He said more than once that the single most important thing that you do as a judge, and particularly as a Supreme Court justice, is you really are ultimately the ambassador for the whole legal system. And he took that role very seriously.
My name's Keith Rigg. I'm the president for the 2013-2014 year for the C. Edwin Moore Inns of Court. We have been speaking to some of the founding members about their recollections both of the inn's founding as well as C. Edwin Moore the man. Today we're here to talk to former Chief Justice Robert Albee. Justice Albee, when the inn was formed, obviously it was decided that his name should be what this inn is known by. How was that decision reached, and was it hard?
Dwight James was really the person who got this the movement for this inn. He contacted me, and then we in turn contacted Federal District Judge William Stewart. The three of us met. I was advocating that it be C. Edwin Moore Inn. Dwight, I think, he was very comfortable with that, and Judge Stewart, I think, was especially comfortable with it because he had served on the Supreme Court with Chief Justice C. Edwin Moore, so they had a relationship, a collegial relationship from that, and it was a decision that was made without much discussion, and we just went forward with the rest of the planning.
And to epitomize the goals of the inn, would that be the person that you would think of first?
Oh yes, as far as from the judiciary part of it, yes. He was really, for me, he was an inspiration.
Explain to everybody a little bit of your career.
I entered the practice of law in 1955, having been a graduate of Drake University Law School. I practiced for about 20 years, mostly a civil litigation practice. In 1975, I received an appointment to the district court. About a year and a half into that experience, the Iowa Court of Appeals was established by the legislature, and I had the opportunity to be a member of that first court. We convened for the first time, as I recall, in around November 1st, 1976, five-member court, and at that time the others selected me the chief judge. In 1978, there were 3 vacancies on the Iowa Supreme Court because of mandatory retirements, and the first being Justice Larry Mason from Mason City. I was appointed to fill his vacancy and moved on to the Supreme Court at that time. After a number of years as a member of the Supreme Court, I made the decision to return to my former law firm and complete my practice years there.
And that law firm was Allers & Koenig, correct?
Yes, they attached my name to it at one time.
Correct. Currently, Allers & Koenig.
Correct.
Let's talk a little bit about C. Edwin Moore. You knew him as a person. When did you first meet him?
I met Chief Moore, it would be in 1954, as a senior law student at Drake Law School. at that time, District Judge Moore taught a class on, I think they called it trial practice. It was a required course. And we met with Judge Moore at the Polk County Courthouse in one of the courtrooms in the evening for that course. And that was an entire year course. So I met him at that time.
My understanding is he was fairly tall, about 6 foot tall.
Yes, Judge Moore was probably around 6 feet. He was a robust person, not overweight or anything like that. Very, very energetic. Moved steadfastly and presented a good appearance.
And it's also my understanding that he grew up in the east side of Des Moines, and one of his enduring passions was for Lee Township.
That's correct. He was a native of that area. His father had been a streetcar conductor, and Judge Moore was born and raised and went to East High School. He used to like to say it's Lee Township against the world.
Did you, after you graduated, after you became licensed, did you practice in front of him?
Yes, I did. I was before him quite frequently, either as a second chair to one of the senior members in the firm where I was associated, or in time I tried a number of cases before him myself over the years before he went on the Supreme Court.
Let's talk about him meeting your wife.
Well, that's an anecdote that I've always enjoyed. In July of 1959, I was in his courtroom in a bench trial. We had spent the day trying the case. Then we were back the next morning. It was very warm. It was hot. We were all without our jackets. And along about the mid-morning recess, Judge Moore announced the recess and leaned over and said, Bob, I want to talk to you. Well, of course, I wondered. He was a constructive critic at times, and so I approached the bench, and he said, I saw you at the ball game last night. This would be down at what was then Sec Taylor Stadium. He said, she looked pretty good to me. I think you ought to follow up. Well, at that time, I was unmarried. Well, a year later, I married her. So I've always contended that I was married as a result of a court decree. I entered the practice, as I said, in 1955. He was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1962. So there was a 7-year interim.
And obviously there have been quite a bit of differences in Des Moines from the mid-50s to now.
Remarkable.
What was the courthouse like then?
The courthouse was open. Security was unheard of. There was no air conditioning, so it got pretty warm in the summertime. There were 6 district judges when I entered the practice. All of the court reporters except one were shorthand reporters. There was one young court reporter who used machines along the lines that are currently used, and we were all a little suspicious of that machine. Things were pretty casual. The judges didn't wear robes, so that if you had a summer case, which was unusual, the judge would come out and with his coat off and invite everybody else to remove theirs. Very, very little trial work in the summer, from June to September.
What was that?
There were 6 judges. 3 of them took a vacation, and the other 3 remained on and handled some criminal matters. And come September 1st, everybody was back together, and there was a case call, I've forgotten the word for it, where we all assembled in a courtroom with a list of civil cases and tried to figure out who was ready and who wasn't, and there were some interesting reasons presented for not being ready for cases. But it was casual, but yet we got things done.
It's also a situation, at least when you were in chambers, where the air might have been just a little bit different than it is now.
Yes, if you were in trial, there'd always be a morning recess and an afternoon recess. And the judges, for the most part, would invite you back into chambers, and it got kind of blue in there from smoke. Some coffee was usually available, and some joking that would take place. Also, some serious matters would be discussed, evidentiary issues, or later, of course, in a case, we would be going over instructions in chambers.
From your experience with Judge Moore as a trial judge, were there any particular instances or stories that you remember?
Well, first of all, he was a very, very good judge. He ran the courtroom with a firm but gentle touch, and he had a sense of humor. He went on the bench originally as a municipal court judge in the 1930s. He himself was only maybe 32 or 34 at the time. I, of course, was not in practice during those years, but I've heard stories about things that happened. It was pretty casual, and one story that stands out is a little bit of a tough initiation for a young lawyer. One of Judge Moore's friends said his firm had retained a young lawyer just out of law school, and they said, we're sending him over to get such and such an order signed, and you may want to have a little fun with him. So when this young lawyer comes into Judge Moore's courtroom and invited to chambers, the judge asked him, well, who are you? And he gave his name. Why are you here? And he said, well, I have this order for you to sign. And the Judge Moore said, well, are you a lawyer? And he said, yes. And he said, well, show me your license. Well, of course, he didn't have any paper license or anything like that to show him. And Judge Moore was insistent, and finally he called the bailiff and said, take this man away. I want to have him arrested for impersonating a lawyer. The poor fellow was taken down the hall for a ways, reportedly later in tears. They released him, told him about it, and everybody had a good time except one person.
You said that he was effervescent as an individual. What was he like in controlling his courtroom?
Well, as I mentioned, he was definitely in command. He had a bold presence, but he was very congenial with the jury, of course, and he was considerate of lawyers. He didn't embarrass anybody in front of the jury with a ruling or any other comments that he made. If he had some critical comments, he would save them or ask or separate the jury from the counsel, from the courtroom for a while. He had a good common sense approach to the trial of a case. He was patient, but he kept the things moving. He'd urge you on if he felt necessary.
He also obviously had command of the respect of the profession, because then eventually he moved from the district court on up.
Oh yes, he was a person, I think most everyone was always pleased to be assigned to his courtroom.
This was also an era where you were elected as a judge, too.
Yes, he was elected to 4 or 5 consecutive terms, 4-year terms as a district judge. And those were partisan elections. However, sometimes they were uncontested. Not a lot of politics went into the judiciary until right at the end of, at least in Polk County, and until about 1958, we had a situation where a district judge was not reelected and someone replaced him.
He then moved up to the Supreme Court.
Yes, he was appointed. He had ambitions to go into the court. He was not subtle about that. And in 1962, there was a vacancy, and he was appointed by Governor Norman Irby. That was just before the effective date of the constitutional amendment, which removed judges from the political process, which actually happened at the election later that year, effective for beginning 1963.
So he was one of the last elected judges.
Yes. He had a good political sense. He came out of that atmosphere in Lee Township and in running for a judgeship on the municipal court, and ultimately moving to the district court.
What's your recollections of him as a Supreme Court justice?
Well, he was just a good, sound, practical justice in that respect. At the time that he went on the court, the Supreme Court did not have clerks, so they were drafting their own decisions without aid of a clerk. They had to depend on the briefs of the parties, perhaps some independent research.
And research in those days would be you went to the law library and pulled out books.
Oh, yes, yes.
And then you sat down at a typewriter.
Yes,
or wrote it longhand.
Or wrote it longhand, or there was some dictation too. But I think most of the justices used the long yellow pad to draft their decisions. It was later in the 1960s when law clerks first became available. It was all a part of the change in the court and the judicial system with the new law becoming effective in 1963. In earlier years, the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice changed every 6 months. There was just an evolution. Everybody sort of took their turn. But along I'm going to say around the 1960s, it became one position. I think with the new law, it was decided that the court would select their own chief. And the first one was the Chief Justice Garfield. And Chief Moore became the Chief Justice late in the 1960s, after he'd been on the court for several years. And he served as such until he reached mandatory retirement in 1978. Mandatory retirement for Chief Moore was age 75. The law provided for age 72 being mandatory retirement, but people who were, quote, grandfathered in were given until age 75.
He was also part of a lot of innovations during that time for the judicial system in Iowa, wasn't he?
Chief Moore was not a person who was satisfied just to carry on the status quo. In a paper I presented a few years ago, I enumerated some of the developments that he either invoked or was involved in making them come into place.
What were some of those developments?
I've got a list here, and it's easier for me to refer to the list.
Fine.
In 1971, we had 18 judicial districts, and those were converted into 8 for purposes of administration and supervision by the court. There was also the establishment in 1971 of the position of state court administrator and the creation of a central research staff to assist the court in handling appellate caseload. As a part of adoption of the unified trial court system, with the aid of the legislature, abolished were the justice of peace courts, which were in use during my early years, mayor's courts, police courts, and municipal courts. In 1973, he promoted the adoption of the Iowa Code of Judicial Conduct, which was new for our state. He was an advocate of the creation of the Client Security Fund and the Attorney Disciplinary Commission, also in 1973. And in 1973, the establishment of a continuing legal education requirement. He was a promoter of the establishment of the Iowa Court of Appeals, citing repeatedly the need for assistance in the appellate backlog, and that court was established in 1976. Meanwhile, the Iowa Supreme Court at that time being made up of 9 members, most of the cases were heard by divisions of 5 justices, so that of the 9, at some point in time, you would probably be on 2 divisions for a month or so. So those are the things. As I said, he wasn't merely there to maintain the status quo. He wanted to modernize the court, and in doing so, improve the justice system.
He was also widely regarded for the opinions he wrote, too.
Yes, he wrote in my experience, a clear and reasonably concise opinion of those he authored. They weren't elaborate or treatises, but they were clear in defining the issues and deciding them.
The political part also helped in forming majorities, I'm sure.
Yes, I was only a member of the court for 3 weeks with him, but from what I know of the comments of other lawyers, he had a good way of pulling people together for consensus. However, allowing dissent where it was necessary. He was a good manager.
You joined the Court of Appeals in 1976.
Yes.
Since the court was new then, what was the relationship between the Court of Appeals judges and the Supreme Court justices?
Well, we were clearly subordinate to that court. The law required that we hear cases in bank, the 5 of us. The law provided, as it still does, that cases are appealed to the Supreme Court, but they are deferred or assigned to the jurisdiction of the Iowa Court of Appeals. The Iowa Court of Appeals decisions are final, except for those from which an application for further review is made, and the Supreme Court may or may not entertain those applications. For the most part, in the past at least, it's been a very small percentage that the Supreme Court took a look at once the Court of Appeals had decided a case.
Once you got to the Court of Appeals, was it always kind of just its own entity, or was there much personal interaction between the Supreme Court personnel and the Court of Appeals personnel?
There was very limited personal interaction. I had more because being the chief of the Court of Appeals, there was a difficulty trying to establish space for the Court of Appeals in the Capitol building. And there were more meetings than I wanted to attend with legislative people and with the building and grounds superintendent. But Chief Moore always invited me, and he also invited the future Chief Justice, Ward Reynolds. And so the 3 of us were together quite a bit during those times. And those were interesting associations.
And at that point, there wasn't this very nice building on a hill which housed the court. They were in the basement of the court of the state capitol, right?
Actually, at first we were housed over on East 14th or 15th Street in a sort of a strip mall location on the 2nd floor, and we had some downstairs space for law clerks. We had very limited library. Most of the research we had to go to the Capitol building for, and that held true until the Secretary of Agriculture's offices moved into the Wallace building, and then we took those quarters, which were directly across the hall. So we weren't really in the basement.
First floor then?
We were on the first
floor.
floor. Yeah, right across from the Supreme Court. But there was a definite separation.
You, as you said, you served on the Supreme Court for 3 weeks with Justice Moore.
Yes.
In that brief time, did you have any assignments from it?
Once my appointment was announced to the Supreme Court, I remained across the hall at the Court of Appeals to finish up some opinions that I was to author and to try to get everything completed so that I just didn't shove them off on someone else. But as I'm doing that, one day I get a call, and it's Chief Justice Moore, and he said, "Bob," he said, "you once told me that you'd be honored to serve on the court with me." And I said, "Yes, sir," and I certainly meant it. And he said, "Well, I tell you what I'm going to do. We've got 3 cases over here that are going to be submitted without oral argument. We need somebody to review the record and the briefs and propose an opinion or a decision for each." And he said, "I know you can handle them, they're no-brainers." Well, one of them, once went before the whole entire Supreme Court, ended up with my opinion becoming the dissent, and in either a 5-4 or 6-3 decision. I can't remember which.
We were talking a little bit about his prowess as a politician. That came in handy as a judge in talking with the legislature, didn't it?
Oh, yes, indeed. Chief Judge Moore was constantly going to the legislature for funds for the function of the judiciary. It was not an easy task, even though it's a separate branch. That branch was and is dependent on the legislature for that. Also, the governor's office usually had a role in approving what the legislature did or what the judiciary was asking. Judge Moore, coming from a political background, was good in that. He knew how to present and cajole legislators and the governor. He had a really good relationship with Governor Bob Ray, because Bob Ray, like me, had been one of his students in law school. So he knew his way around the Capitol building, and was very effective. And as I mentioned earlier, it was through his energies and ideas that the Iowa Court of Appeals was created.
And he was able to get funding for that as well.
Yes, he did, and eventually he got a space in the Capitol building.
And in the Capitol building, that's an important thing, is to find space in the actual building, isn't it?
That's correct, yeah. It's just a matter of practicality. That's where the cases are heard. That's where the research is done. It was very inconvenient to travel back and forth during the months that we were over on East 15th.
Both of you also knew C. Edwin Moore.
Oh, absolutely.
What do you remember?
He had one of the best grasp of the law from a practical standpoint, and taught from the beginning in law school, and when he was conducting the trial phase of our education. Civility. He started out that way, and explaining to us that you didn't have to sneak around and do stuff like that to be a good lawyer. As a matter of fact, he said you should be upfront and honest and do your work and be ready for trial when you walked into the pit. I had the honor of arguing to the Supreme Court of the state of Iowa the last case that he tried as a district court judge. And it was against Pete Donato, I think, was the plaintiff's was the defense lawyer. It was a criminal case, and he was on the bench, but of course he couldn't participate. But he came down, shaking your hand, and telling him what a great job I'd done. So that was kind of,
Yeah.
he was just a fantastic fellow.
What do you remember of it?
Well, I remember that he, again, he was a fellow who was well-grounded because he'd been elected as a municipal court judge and a district court judge. And, you know, at the municipal court level, he interacted with people at, you know, their most basic needs and levels. And he was kind and he was thoughtful, but he had a great sense of humor and a little bit of a rascal. He liked practical jokes, and but overall a very decent, kind, bright man.
And a true East Sider.
You bet. My first appearance was I was an assistant county attorney, and one of his old friends came in to have his client arraigned, and Judge Moore was on the bench, and of course I would have never thought of calling him anything but Judge Moore, and that if you didn't address him properly, you'd be in jail, and so here's this guy who is an East Sider, and one of his old pals, and he says, "Ed." I thought, oh my God, the world's going to come down. But they were pals, and I think everybody got a square shake. But he did like his East Side pals.
I remember an anecdote. Tell you something about Judge Moore too. There was a lawyer here, was a few years ahead of me, who was pretty successful in the trial practice as representing mostly plaintiffs. A law school friend of his with an insurance company convinced him to defend a case one time for the insurance company. The case came in with a pretty good sized verdict for the plaintiff, and Judge Moore had taken the jury verdict and was calling the lawyers, and he called up this lawyer and he said, say, Dick, you're still getting those big verdicts. But the big verdict was against his client.
Vinegar on that. Yeah, I forgot one thing I should never forget. I think he was responsible for my getting my job with the county attorney's office. I was just out of law school, and my dad took me over to meet Judge Moore, who I already knew, but on a different level. And we met in his chambers, and my dad said something to him about, you know, if you can help out or whatever it was. And I think he put in a word, and I got the job, and it was a really important thing in my career to get that first job.
You know, he did the same for me. I was with the Attorney General's office. That's when I argued the case before the Supreme Court, right out of law school.
Yeah.
You know? And the firm of Stewart, Crouch and Hopkins needed a new lawyer and a lawyer who could try lawsuits. C. Edwin called me into the court's chambers and said, I'm giving you this guy's name. His name's Babe Crouch. And you should call him on the phone, and he would like to interview you for a job. And I did, and they hired me, and that's when I entered the private practice of law 8 months after I graduated from law school. So C. Edwin Moore never forgot a friend.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah.
David L. Brown was Chief Justice Moore's last clerk in 1978. Hear now from him.
When Justice Moore started as a trial judge, in those days judges were elected, right?
They were.
Why don't you talk about kind of his recollections about that process?
Oh, he had very profound recollections of that process. He was instrumental in supporting the Missouri plan that thank heavens we have now in Iowa, in terms of appointments with then retentions afterwards. And he basically talked about a period of time when, depending on the winds of political fate, the district court bench could be literally cleared out by the voters in November, with the judges having very little chance to defend themselves against whatever charges were made, which brings real memories of recent issues with retentions. Only this was worse. This was on the ground really every election cycle. But he told stories, and this is, I think, in part his humanity, but this is one reason his court was so effective, because most of the people on that court had been through elective judicial politics. So their people skills were well honed. They were, if you think of the grace and the manner in which Governor Ray conducts himself, or you think of the grace in which Neil Smith conducts himself, all who grew up in this kind of rough and tumble era, well, they learned a lot of all of that from the real master of really retail politics, and that was C. Edwin Moore, who talked stories about standing in the Union lines outside of the different packing plants, or Firestone, or any place else, and he could go into that Union Hall and could talk to people in a way where he's one of them, because he was one of them. He grew up in the East Side, and he stayed in the East Side, and he basically had very much a connection to the people of his area, and he talked about that. And I think that was one of the skill sets that he really relished. Probably, I'm not sure he could have ever lost an election, but he really saw it as corrosive because he could see the money potential and really good people not really being able to basically be retained because of that. And he was one of the people who really pushed for the Missouri Plan being adopted, which has served Iowa well, with one notable exception.
Ward Reynoldson was appointed to the Iowa Supreme Court in 1971 and served under Chief Moore. In 1978, Reynoldson followed Moore as Chief Justice.
It was nice to be in the State House when Judge Moore was Chief Justice. He was a very congenial person and kind of took me under his wing, and we had a nice time. We ate lunch together every day, and then the court came together in session week, and that was always a good time, seeing other people and visiting with them. Even though you might fight like hell in the conference room, we were friends otherwise.
And never got personal.
Yeah.
The discussions about the law.
Yeah, the day that we really voted out the cases and had our final arguments back and forth, we'd all go out that night with our spouses and have dinner, a little social hour dinner, and that kind of smoothed things over if there were any ruffled feathers, and it was a good thing.
A Chief Justice who's trying to evoke some changes that require legislation has to be a politician in some part. And you've talked about it here a bit, about being over there on the last day of the session, legislative session, trying to convince people to do it. Tell me how you got started down that path as Chief Justice. Did you get any training by C. Edwin Moore in that regard? Or?
I was under his wing for a number of years, from 71 to 78, and it was watching him up close. It gave you a few clues. I was never as good as he was, but it gave you some ideas.
Hear now from him as to some of the changes accomplished while he was on the court with Chief Moore.
We did away with Justice of Peace, Mayor's Court, Police Courts, Superior Courts, and Municipal Courts. And we wound up with district court judges and associate district court judges and magistrates, and it was, I think, it was a good move.
Following that changed. There was also a requirement of lawyers to do mandatory continuing legal education. Were you part of that as well?
Yes, I was a ringleader in that. Much to the disappointment, I think, of maybe some of my friends, but we mandated it not only for the lawyers but the judges, and I thought that was important that we get the judges involved. And we had at the time we had a poll that we did to the lawyers, the bar, and then there was a place for comments, and some of those comments you would have found amusing. For example, be sure to include the judges. They need it worse than the lawyers do, and this sort of thing, you know.
It was an anonymous poll, I bet.
Yes, it was. But,
also, the Client Security Fund was another change.
Yeah, we were on that mandatory CLE. We were the second state in the union to adopt that, and in client security, we were the first state in the union to adopt the client security fund concept, and including the auditing of lawyers' trust accounts. And we appointed a person to go out and audit these accounts, and of course the first ones they audited were the Renelson firm at Osceola, Iowa. Fortunately, no one wound up in jail.
Louis A. Lavorato knew Chief Justice Moore first in his trial advocacy class and later became Chief Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court. Hear now from him.
I always wanted to be a trial lawyer, and so I took everything that came through the door. I took it with the idea that hopefully I'd get enough business I could concentrate on just litigation, and that's what happened. I became a trial lawyer.
Were there people who influenced you in that direction? You said you always wanted to be a trial lawyer. There are different areas of practice, of course, and the courtroom is itself a specialty.
In those days, I didn't have any mentors except judges. And I used to go down, and if I had a problem or anything, I'd go down and talk to the judge, and they'd give me some good advice. I'd try cases, and they critique my performances in these trials after the trials. So those people were my mentors, and they encouraged me to be a trial lawyer. One of my biggest mentors was former Chief Justice C. Edwin Moore. I call him my mentor. Anytime I had a problem, I could call him. I was honored to be a pallbearer at his funeral. That's how close I was to him. I'll give you a story about old Chief. When he retired, he came down. I was chief at the time, chief in Polk County, the 5th Judicial District. He came down to work, and I gave him he wanted to handle the post-conviction relief actions, and I gave him all those cases, and he did a beautiful job. I can remember one time, the Court of Appeals reversed one of his cases. And he was so angry. I said, well, Chief, don't give up yet. You know, there could be an application for further review to the Supreme Court. Take care of it. By God, that's what happened. There was an application for further review in the Supreme Court. They took it and affirmed his decision.
Is that right?
Yeah. He was quite a guy.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about C. Edwin Moore?
His engagement with young people was unbelievable. His engagement with the bench was terrific. His interaction with the political process was, I think, unmatched and has never been matched. And I think the practicing bar really revered him.
Thomas J. Shields, clerk for Federal District Court Judge William Stewart, who was on the Supreme Court with Chief Justice Moore and became a federal magistrate judge. He sent Judge Shields up to see Chief Justice Moore to apply for admission to the Iowa bar. Hear now from him.
When we visited earlier, you told me a story about C. Edwin Moore and talking about Judge Stewart. Was that when you were sworn in as a new Iowa lawyer, or how did that go?
No, that was a fun experience because obviously not being from Iowa and not knowing anyone here other than Judge Stewart and a few other people. But when I was applying to take the Iowa bar, I had to have my application signed by a judge of an Iowa court, and federal court didn't count. And Judge Stewart, having been a member of the Supreme Court, knew just who I should see, and he called the Chief Justice, C. Edwin Moore, and asked him if it would be all right if I came to visit him and had him review my application and, if appropriate, sign it. And the chief said, "Sir, come on up." And so I did, and it's a great experience. I'd never been to the State House before, and went in and sat down and met with the Chief Justice one-on-one, and we chatted, and he was just a very gregarious, friendly person, and gave me a few digs at being a Hoosier as opposed to a Hawkeye, and then signed my application. And as I was getting ready to leave, he looked at me and he said, very seriously, "Tom, when you get back down the hill, I want you to ask Bill Stewart one question. Why would any judge of the highest court of the state leave it for the lowest federal court in the country?" I delivered that message as I was directed by the Chief Justice, and as you can imagine, Judge Stewart got a great laugh out of that, and with his sense of humor, I think he, after I left his office, I think he called the Chief Justice, and they had a great laugh together.
Why don't you talk a little bit about Justice Moore as a person?
Well, that's interesting, particularly for people that never had a chance to meet him, but he grew up on the east side of Des Moines in Lee Township, an area over by East High School. Generally, he lived in the same area, I think, for his entire lifetime, less than 2 miles to the Capitol. He could remember just about anything and everything about growing up there, attending East High School, going to Drake, knowing the people there. But people he went to high school with would actually come to the Capitol once in a while, and you'd have thought he was still in high school. All the pretense was gone. I've told this story at different in meetings before, but one of my particular favorites is the chief had a gatekeeper secretary who was pretty protective of his time and his privacy to make sure he could get his things done. But if one of these friends showed up, all pretense was gone. The one story that I'm really fond of saying that way is he had a older gentleman show up one day at the court, and he was pretty dilapidated. He was pretty down on his luck, and he wanted to see Judge Moore. And so Ruby asked the chief if he could come out. He came out. Charlie, first thing he says to the Chief Justice is, he says, "Eddie, how are you?" And then he caught himself, and he basically said, "I'm sorry, Chief Justice Moore." And the chief said immediately, "Charlie, if you didn't call me Eddie, nobody'd call me Chief." And that was the kind of humble component he had, and that was no pretense. He was like that with everybody. And I do feel the other part that's interesting. We say this sometimes. Do we know the people in the clerk's office? Do we know the people in the building? Do we know the people that take care of offices? He not only knew them, actually he'd be there when they got there, and he'd be there when they left, and he would commend them on taking care of the people's building, as he called it. And this wasn't his space in the court. This wasn't his office. This was their space. So he was never too busy to basically bring these people back into his private chambers, give them what he called the cook's tour of the whole court complex, because he really felt very much that was part of what he should be doing, to basically tell the story to everybody.
Michael Gartner was a former editor of the Des Moines Register and president of NBC News. He knew Chief Justice Moore in the former occupation. Hear now from him.
I came out here in '74 to be the editor of the Register.
And you got licensed here as well, correct?
Well, yeah, I got waved in by the judge.
And is that the first time that you'd met Justice Moore?
No, I was. I'd been here several years, and I was in his court a lot. We were a pretty aggressive newspaper, and we were sued periodically, and so I was quite familiar with the Iowa Supreme Court at that time, and I'd run into him. And after I'd been here about 6 months, he called me and said, "I understand you're you're a lawyer. And I said, well, yeah. And he said, member of the New York Bar? And I said, yes. He said, did you take and pass the bar? And I said, yes. He said, I'd like to swear you in to Iowa. And I said, you know, Judge, I took one bar and I will never ever take another bar exam as long as I live. He said, no. He said, we have reciprocity. I can waive you in. And I said, well, I don't want to do it. He said, why? And I said, I'm not going to practice law. I don't really want to do it. And so he called me back for 6 months. Or I'd run into him and say, you know, and I said, no, Judge, I don't want to do it. So one time, probably 5 years later, he called and he said, I'm getting ready to retire, and before I retire, I want to swear you in to the Iowa Bar. And I said, oh, Judge, I said, you know, I think it's too late. I think the reciprocity only lasts for so many years after you pass the bar in New York. He says, those are guidelines. I wrote them. Be in my court next Tuesday at 9. So I was in his court next Tuesday at 9, and I walked up, and there were all 9 justices were in their robes and in that beautiful old courtroom in the Capitol, and he had invited my family and the people I work with, and it turned into a lovely ceremony. And he swore me in, and he talked about the wonders of the First Amendment and how important free speech was and a free press was to America. And he went on. It was really, really lovely. And then he swore me in and dismissed court, and he said, now don't go away. So I said, okay. And so we walked over. I don't know if you remember the old courtroom in the Capitol, and up on the hill, and he looked over downtown Des Moines, and you could see the Register and Tribune building, and he had his arm, he's a bear, kind of a bear of a man, you know, and he had his arm around me, and put his foot up on the radiator or the windowsill or something, and he said, I can't tell you how many times I've looked out this window at that building, talking about the Register and Tribune, and said, how could those guys have so missed the point of that brilliant decision we handed down yesterday? Or I've looked down and said, how can those editorial writers on the Tribune have just misunderstood the case that was argued here last week? You know, and he said, I didn't know what to do. And it bothered me. And he said, several years ago I came upon a solution. But he said, it's taken me years and years to get it done. But he said, I got it done today. And he gave me a great big squeeze. And he says, because as of today, you son of a bitch, you come under the rules of the Iowa Supreme Court. So, that's how I got waived into the Iowa Bar.
And as you said, the Register, in particular in that time period that you were there, was very aggressive in making sure that news got covered, particularly in the courts.
Well, we were more. It was a little bit different. That's true. Everything you say is true. But we had an in-house law firm that had 4 to 5 lawyers in it, run by my former colleague Gary Gerlach. And so we did 2 things. We told every small weekly and small radio station in the state, anytime they had a problem, call us, and we would take care of it for them at no fee, whether it was trying to get a city council meeting open or get a document or something like that, because we believed the state had to have that. And then the other thing, we stationed a lawyer in the newsroom every day. It was called Chief Lawyer on Duty, known as the Clod. And anytime a reporter had an issue, had a question, wanted to get something, that lawyer was right there, and they'd go say, how do I do this? And then also there was a lot of preventive reading of copy before it got in the paper to say, well, yeah, you can't say that, you can say that, that person's litigious, you better be careful, and if you really want to beef it up, you can do this and everything. So the lawyers were an instrumental part of the news gathering and printing process, and that more than anything is what made the Register a really great newspaper in the 70s and 80s. It wasn't the editors, it was the publisher in that they were willing to spend that money, but it was great reporters and great lawyers. If there was an issue with the courts, for instance, I called him up one morning and I said, Chief, Judge Osmondson closed a courtroom over in Cedar Rapids on us this morning. And he said, be in my chambers at 2 this afternoon with your lawyer. I mean, just like that. And so we were up in the chambers at 2, and he heard the issue, and he ordered Judge Osmondson to open the court. And Judge Osmondson kind of sort of did and sort of didn't. And I think we were back there the next day too. And the chief made it clear that the court was to be open. So yes, anytime there was an issue, but even if there were other issues, it seemed to me we got expedited we got expedited service. The court was a great court with an understanding of the state, a great love of the law, and a great belief in freedom and liberty. And they were very, very protective of the people's rights and the press's rights, and didn't want to see any abuse. And that wasn't just Judge Moore. That was Justice Reynoldson and Justice Albee and Justice McCormick and Justice Harris and all of them. It was just a terrific court.
Explain to folks kind of the person that he was.
Well, he was, I don't mean this in a pejorative way at all. I mean it in a complimentary way. But he was sort of an East Side Cracker Barrel politician. Kind of guy who'd sit around the store and talk. He understood the community. He understood politics, and he understood and loved the law. I would say he understood and loved the community. He understood and loved politics, and he understood and loved the law and the court. And so, lots of times there are judges who are maybe a little aloof on purpose. He'd mixed it up. He was an ordinary guy. Even after he became Chief Justice, he was an ordinary guy.
And always proud to be an East Sider.
Yeah, very, very proud to be an East Sider. Lee Township against the world, and he was extremely proud to be from Lee Township.
Since the creation of the Inn, in particular in the first meeting of the year, we've had the opportunity to hear from you many years, where you have explained your time with Justice Moore and who he was as a person. What kind of legacy do you think this inn creates by keeping his name alive with it?
I do tell this one story when I'm given the opportunity to speak at the end of the story of Abe Bass, which is really one of my favorites. Abe Bass was an older lawyer from Cedar Rapids who had survived the Holocaust. And he came to America and set up a practice in Cedar Rapids. Had a good career, brought his grandson to the Capitol in the summertime one year, and he wanted his grandson to see the courthouse, wanted him to see the court. Unfortunately, it was the summertime and everything was locked up like Fort Knox. He went down to the clerk's office hoping to get in. The clerk summoned the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice dropped everything he was doing, had the lights light on to the courtroom, and ultimately had Abe Bass and his grandson come in. Court was announced by the clerk of court. Essentially went this way: young man, would you come up and approach the bench? Tell me who you are. Tell me why you're here. And he heard the little boy out. He was about 10 years old. And actually, he then said, well, young man, now I have a little something to tell you. Your grandpa is a fine man, and he's a wonderful, wonderful lawyer. We're very proud of him, proud to have him here. We're so proud to have you in our courtroom today. And then you can now close court. That gentleman and that little boy told that story to an awful lot of people for a very long time. He'd survived really the Holocaust and was almost exterminated. And he would always say, only in America, only in America. But it wasn't just only in America, only C. Edwin Moore could have pulled that off. And there were many stories like that over decades. That's one of my favorites.